Could the difficult times we find ourselves in give rise to new and innovative ways to endure and thrive? In fact, could those innovative ways include re-examining strategic partnerships as we know it to make it better serve industries? Our guest today has had a ringside seat into how trade associations have developed over the past few decades, as well as into strategic partnerships, and believes that may very well be the case. Hello and welcome to the Predictable B2B Success podcast, brought to you by Sproutwood.com. I'm Vinay Koshy, and our guest today is Dan Varroney. Dan, you are the president and CEO of the Potomac Corp, a strategic consulting firm that specializes in association transformation and industry-focused strategic partnerships. You're also the author of a relatively new book, Reimagining Industry Growth, Strategic Partnership Strategies in an Era of Uncertainty. Just a bit of background on Dan. He's a much sought-after expert on economic performance, supply chain issues, and strategic partnerships. His book, of course, demonstrates how utilizing these institutional frameworks can help business leaders leverage the collective strength of supply chains and value chains to overcome challenges, address uncertainty, mitigate risks, and position their industries for growth. Dan, I believe you've spent something like 30 years successfully transforming trade associations. And they, I believe, were rooted in quite a simple philosophy that you advocate for, which is that we should act on what we know instead of what we think. So I'm curious, why go from working with trade associations, given the success that you've had, to starting your own consultancy?
So, great question. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's interesting. I think that every career has a lifespan, and I had a wonderful career, almost 30 years working for and at trade associations. But I reached a point that I was ready for something new or different, and I really thought through what that might be. And what helped me is I really looked at where things were. So we had come out of the Great Recession. The whole way that decisions were being made by industries and by businesses had changed. The global economy was continuing to change. And I viewed trade associations as likely platforms or partners for industries to better shape the external environment and create what I would call more suitable environments in which industries could operate. So I built a business around strategy. The strategy is based on market research. The market research is utilized to generate discussions and brainstorming from industry leaders and their trade association strategic partners. So I wanted to, and at the end of the day, what I was really looking for was the ability to have a legacy beyond trade associations. And I opened the company 10 and a half years ago, and it has far exceeded my expectations. And every day is a joy for me.
Excellent. I'm curious, you've obviously had quite a wealth of experience and quite a journey to date, I'm sure. What would you say is your personal area of strength?
So that is another really terrific question. There are a lot of practicing consultants who consider themselves an expert. My area of strength is that I'm a student. And a good student asks great questions. They're inquisitive and they never believed that they've learned or they've learned enough, and they keep asking questions. And I think my greatest strength is the ability to be a great student and the ability to continually listen, learn, grow.
And in that area of strength, what would you say is something that businesses don't know but should? And I ask the questions because it's a quite commonly held belief that we should all improve and grow. But is there something more to this attitude of learning and being curious that most businesses don't get?
What's interesting for me, Vinay, is that we live in an era of chronic uncertainty. The chronic uncertainty clearly started with the Great Recession, and then COVID really added to it. We've got global conflict with Russia and Ukraine, and anybody who believes they have it nailed and they understand really needs to step back and say, what else do I need to know? What else do I need to understand? Because we live in a day and age where we can never be too sure about anything anymore. So I practice what I call insatiable curiosity, that with whatever I see, I try to understand more. So right now we're working with a new client, and we had some, just in the last few days, some new things come to light. And as a result, we're going to refocus the work that we do to support them. So why is that? Because we had a very long meeting to start our work together, and my team and I asked a lot of questions, and we learned things that we didn't know before. So it's just imperative nowadays for everyone to really understand what the challenges are, what the facts really are. And then once you understand that, what's behind everything? Is there something that we don't know? It's imperative nowadays to know what we don't know.
An interesting perspective in insatiable curiosity. How would you characterize insatiable curiosity? Is it just a matter of asking why and why until you get to an answer where there's no further core beliefs to explore, or is there more to it? Because sometimes there are a whole realm of facets that we could potentially explore. Where do you kind of draw the line or boundaries,
So
as it were?
if you look at the work that we do, our work is iterative, right? And because our work is iterative, we can never be satisfied with where things are. We're always looking to see if there's anything new or different. So I think for any business leader today, you can have a strategy, but I think it's more important to have a scenario plan, to understand what things might be if things don't go the way you think. And supporting that, you'll want to have the ability to really understand what different scenarios might look like and what situations might lead you to pursue different scenarios. It's not what I've learned about strategy over 10 and a half years. So I've interviewed some 2,000 industry executives. And for my book, I interviewed 24 industry executives. And what was fascinating to me, what was absolutely fascinating to me, was this sense of confidence and curiosity displayed by these industry executives. And it was just enough confidence, but a lot more curiosity. And I was find that fascinating, but it really speaks to the ever-changing global business environment today. It's a very challenging environment. Look at the supply chain issue. I know some might say things are better. They're really not better from a supply chain perspective. Here in the United States, there's a lot of conversation and a lot of policy direction leading towards reshoring and nearshoring, and a lot of discussion around that, what the implications of that are and what that might mean. There are issues around semiconductor manufacturing, right? So you've got the TSMC, the largest high-end chip maker in the world in Taiwan, and they're opening a substantial plant in Arizona, which is a very good thing. So we live in a very complex and challenging world. We just have to make sure that we know what we don't know, and not be cocky in the way we make decisions, to be as well informed as we might.
Trade associations traditionally have always had a bit of a inside out focus or approach. I believe that may still be the case. Is that true?
So the answer is, from someone like me who's worked inside of a trade association and had the opportunity and the honor to serve as the CEO a few times or twice. What was interesting is that you can become pretty well absorbed with the challenges that you're facing. You're working with a board of directors, you're working with a membership, and you're working with a staff. And you're running a business, you're running a profit and loss, and it's got to work. And what I learned is that you can really get hyper-focused and internally focused, sometimes too internally focused. And inside out is a very narrow, very limiting pathway for both trade associations and for businesses. As I was writing my book and doing research with my team in my book, what was interesting is that the most successful companies, the ones who were durable, the ones who were consistently profitable, tended to look at things from the outside in. So outside in, the short and important definition of that is that you're customer focused, not just market focused, you're customer focused. You're seeing and feeling things as the marketplace does. Because at the end of the day, if you're guided and directed by what your marketplace sees and thinks, your ability, your capacity to align with them and act with them is far greater. And if so, you've got the ability to build a long-term meaning strategic partnership, something that win-win. By helping your customer, your member be more successful, the organization will be more successful. The same holds true for a company, whether it be small, medium-sized, or a large multinational corporation. Again, even if you've got shareholders, even if you've got aggressive shareholders, even if you have aggressive outside investors, at the end of the day, you are going to be judged by how satisfied your customer is. And the way you know how satisfied they are is they're going to keep buying your product, or they're going to buy more of your product. So at the end of the day, the outside-in strategy, and it may sound simple or fundamental, but it really isn't. So the work that we do with our clients is about positioning from the outside in. We literally determine how aligned they are with their members. And if they're not well aligned, that tells us early on that they're inside out versus outside in. It's imperative to be outside in, because outside in is a foundational component of building that long-term strategic partnership. You want to help your customers and or your members win. If they win, you win. If they win big, you win big.
Is stating that sufficient to bring about a change of perspective for an association that does have an inside-out focus, or is there more of an education process required?
What's interesting is, note just a few minutes ago, I said that our process was iterative. Part of our process being iterative is it's a change management process.
Yep.
Listen closely, it is a change management process. It starts from the work that we do at the beginning. It starts from the internal interviews we do with some of the staff. It starts with the interviews that we do with either with the board or industry leaders. It continues with the survey research. The staff sees the survey research and it's just like a big gasp and a gulp. And I tell them ahead of time, there's no reason to get into a gasp or a gulp. Remember, we were looking to understand where the industry was and how aligned they saw you with their challenges and their outcomes. And almost always, the level of alignment is not as significant as they hoped. So it's a change management process, clearly from a trade association perspective and also from a board perspective, because they're not quite sure what to expect, because they've been through these processes before, and it was almost always focused on the association. Imagine that. And what's interesting about industry executives today is that there's fewer of them at the top of the pyramid. The pressure to produce on the bottom line and the top line and the quarterly and the annual earnings is incredibly high. So in order for them to be involved in a trade association or an association today, it has got to be a direct reflection of what it is they need to achieve or what the industry needs to achieve over the next 25 years. So think of the trade association more nowadays as a strategic business unit, not just an extension of an industry, a strategic business unit that sees, thinks, acts as an industry would, that they serve as a partner, that they have the ability to see, understand, and adapt and drive to where the industry is going.
Okay, this idea of strategic partnerships, as you allude to in your book, how does that fit in? Are you suggesting that trade associations take the lead in developing these strategic partnerships across industry?
Good question. What I learned in the research in writing the book, it's that the industries wanted to build the strategic partnerships, not the other way around.
Right.
This was deliberate on the part of the industry. Some very quick history as I learned it in writing the book. Clearly, strategic partnerships between companies have been taking place for years. Some of the more notable ones are, think of Starbucks and Barnes & Noble, or Starbucks and PepsiCo. And in both of those cases, Starbucks was looking to get to markets or customers that they didn't have access to, and these partnerships help them be successful in that way. The same for PepsiCo. What is new and different about these strategic partnerships is that there was a time that trade associations were able to function exceedingly well on their own, even though they were inside-out organizations. But something new and different happened, and those new and different things happened to be the Great Recession, happened to be COVID. this almost daily breakthrough on new and different technologies and innovation. Global competition, the world keeps getting smaller, and these partnerships become more and more necessary. And industries look to partner with trade associations who have CEOs that reflect the same thinking, traits, and characteristics that they have, because they want to know they're partnering with people that share the same values, see things the way they do. And then from there, they build partnerships with strategies, strategic plans, and governance that says, we're going to measure our success as we go through these things, but we are going to build our strategy together, not apart.
Just going back to the couple of examples that you mentioned for some of our listeners who may not reside in the US, the strategy that you're talking about between Barnes & Nobles and Starbucks,
Sure.
I believe was Starbucks coming into Barnes & Noble stores to offer coffee to people who read through their books.
So, yes, you're right. This is a global podcast in context. So here in the United States, the concept of the bricks and mortar bookstores has very much become a thing of the past. And in order for a company like Barnes & Noble to have successful bookstores, they were looking to create an experience. So the experience was, clearly we want people to feel like they can come in and feel comfortable in a nice setting and environment. The partnership with Starbucks created something different. So the Starbucks concept globally is creating a third place between work and home. Each of these Starbucks coffee stores are their own business, in that every community operates in their own. People that go in there will go in there to have a coffee, a pastry, even some of their tea or cappuccino or frappuccino, and they'll meet their friends, or they'll work on their own, or they'll do business calls or FaceTime calls or Zoom calls from their iPads or their Apple computers or their iPhones. And what Barnes & Noble said is, we want to remain durable and viable. So we're going to look at reimagining the experience that we create for our customers. Starbucks had the brand of being notoriously focused from the outside in on their customers. And like every other multinational corporation, they were looking to grow. So they now have these coffee shops and the baristas, and they even serve hot sandwiches and soups at these Barnes & Noble stores here in the United States. My wife and I go to them pretty often, any time of the year. Sometimes it's a pretty good date night. We'll go and get a coffee or a pastry, and if it's on a weekend, we'll get a sandwich or a bowl of soup, and we'll sit and talk, or we'll get a magazine or a paper, or we'll go look for the next book that we want to read. So what's happened is that Barnes & Noble is one of the very last remaining standalone bricks and mortar bookstores. But that's the power of a strategic partnership. It's, what are we both trying to achieve, and how can we work together to achieve an outcome that benefits both? And
with the other example between the PepsiCo and the Starbucks, that had to do with the
Frappuccino. So think about this interesting thing. So you can get any number of flavor Frappuccinos here in the United States. There's the mint Frappuccino for Christmas, and before that for the fall Frappuccino and the pumpkin and so on. But what they did is they developed, in partnership with PepsiCo, a bottled version of the Frappuccino. And PepsiCo has got distributors not only all over the country, but all over the world. What this partnership did was give them development and distribution capacity that they didn't have. I think now it's a $600 or $700 million business. Nice partnership.
Absolutely. It's interesting listening to what you were saying. It brings up a few ideas that kind of key to forming these partnerships. One, of course, being the customer focus, that they both have a similar customer that they're trying to reach and touch through the experiences that they're trying to create, which also speaks to the relationship side of things, both between the potential partners as well as with their customers, and of course, the business side of things. Is there more to the key elements that you consider as being vital to a strategic partnership?
Yes. So it's this notion of governance, meaning, how are we going to work together?
Right.
How are we going to measure our success? How are we going to be transparent? Because at the end of the day, culture drives everything. Without it, it's not going to work. So you remember the business phrase that culture eats strategy for breakfast?
Yeah.
You've got to have a strong culture. A strong culture can overcome everything. The strong culture, if there's collaboration, there can be shared collaboration, there could be shared brainstorming, shared innovation. Culture means everything.
I love what you're saying. It's a topic that's close to my heart. I often refer to it as developing your relationship OS or operating system as a way of putting it. It's interesting. We often look on the podcast at developing culture within an organization. But you're talking about developing a common culture between organizations, which poses a new set of challenges and problems.
So the answer is, look at it this way. These relationships just don't happen, right? They don't snap your fingers, they don't happen. There's a lot of testing that goes on at both sides. Is it going to work, or could it work, or could it not work? People get to know each other. They really sound each other out. And there's an extended period of time by which they assess whether or not it's going to work, because it might not. It might, but it might not. So you've got to take the time to do that. What's interesting to me is that here in the United States, we have a hyper-partisan political system. And what's fascinating to me is I often wonder if each side not just listens to the other side, but hears the other side. Because there was a day and time where members of both parties would go out to lunch or go out to dinner, and they'd build these relationships between their parties and individually. And I read about that all the time. And I wonder the extent to which political parties here in the United States can say, what is it we need to do to hear one another? And how can we find common ground? And because I believe at the end of the day, it really works. But one of the things that was interesting, though, changing topics, in terms of my book, here's what was fascinating of the 5 industries that we researched and the executives that we interviewed. Do you know that in each of the 5 case studies that I wrote, that there was no focus whatsoever on who the party in power was? It was more about, first of all, building the relationship between the trade association, the industry and the trade association, and then building these larger ecosystems. Who in the supply chain or the value chain can we bring along that will be part of something really substantial? How can we help extend the industry's reach in a way that'll be beneficial for all of us? It was really impressive to me. And in some cases, I even found things like non-traditional partnerships, which are always really impressive to me. That's the ability to go to somewhere else where others might thought of, oh my God, didn't work in the past, why should it work now? And then it worked. I just think that COVID, here's what's interesting. If you look on the bright side and you say the glass is half full, not half empty, it created the opportunity to reimagine, right? Because it really flushed all the old definitions down the drain. So what I said, look, I started to write the book when we went into lockdown. That's when I started to write the book. And I said, what the heck? I can't go anywhere. I still had a lot of client work to do, but I had a lot of other time. So I just said, I'm determined to learn something here. And what I learned was that the old rules no longer applied, that we could rethink, we could reinvent, and we could reimagine. So my guidance to any of your podcast listeners is as follows. Don't look at how impossible things are. Don't look at how bad things are. Look at what might be, what could be, and reimagine it, and build strategic partnerships that get you from where you are to where you both can get to together.
Interesting. And I say interesting because it brings up a few thoughts in my head, one of which is it requires certainly a degree of openness and the leadership level from both organizations, industries. But also, I think in order to make it work, you need culture, but the culture needs to be driven by people who are very open to new ways of thinking and almost champions to the idea.
Here's what's interesting. A few things I'll share with you. Early in my career, I worked with an executive coach who was just marvelous. She literally transformed me, and I'll never forget that. And one of the things that I learned is you lead with an open hand, not a closed fist. And what that means in today's day and age is as follows. we've got the ability to bring a lot of people along with us if we're willing to not just partner, but be vulnerable. We have to be vulnerable. And what I've really been struck by, especially with some of the big CEOs that I talk to, is their ability to be vulnerable. If you're vulnerable and you're willing to lead with an open hand and not a closed fist, you will bring allies along. You will create change, and your chances of driving big transformational change are much higher with that approach.
Certainly. Would you say that, I think you alluded to the fact that we need to be listening to each other in order to make this work. On a surface level, I think a lot of people would agree that they are pretty good listeners. However, if I'm hearing you correctly, there's a lot more to this idea of listening. It is perhaps to empathize as well as show compassion for their...
Yes, I will tell you, one today in the world has got their own set of challenges. And it's imperative that you work with humanity, that you're compassionate, that you're forgiving, that you're humble, that you're vulnerable. What you'll find interesting is my firm partners with a market research firm by the name of Edge Research. And one of the founders, a person who founded the business 25 years ago, that he and I have become very close friends over the last 7 years. And we are incredibly humble with each other. We are incredibly compassionate with each other, and we're incredibly vulnerable with each other. And this person was one of the people that helped me imagine the book and reviewed some of the draft chapters. And candidly, my business, my company wouldn't be doing as successful today as it had not been for them. And that's just the God's honest truth. I've got another person who's a former trade association executive. He transformed his life. He's a full professor at George Mason and an economist, and one of the smartest people I've ever met. I'm not nearly as smart as he is. And we're incredibly compassionate and vulnerable, and we listen to each other, and it's a remarkable relationship. I practice that with my own company, and I encourage others to do the same thing. There's so much more we could do together than apart. And by the way, it's a lot more fun doing it together. The partnership and building things, I have so much more fun with the people I work with. I really do. As a matter of fact, the one person I told you about, my wife and I are going to Florida to see our granddaughters in between the Christmas and New Year's holiday. And he's going to be down there with his wife, and we're going to get together. It's just, one, because he's fun, two, because he's funny, and three, because he's an exceptional intellect. And what you'll find interesting is that here in the United States, in baseball terms, we're both from New York. He's a New York Mets fan. I'm a Yankees fan. He and I have different political views, but it doesn't matter to us. It doesn't matter to us. And we just have fun doing what we're doing. I had a big challenge with a new client. We talked on Friday, and in 30 minutes, we talked it out. And I was like, okay, got it. We do this all the time. It's the power of strategic partnerships, being humble, being vulnerable, being compassionate. I always believe that you always get what you give, and you get what you give when you don't try to get what you give. You just do it out of sincerity.
In terms of exploring potential partnerships with trade associations where we're trying to move the needle for entire industries, is there a framework that we could use to ensure that we can find common ground a little bit quickly than kind of shooting in the dark, so to speak? If so, what would that look like?
It really comes down to a handful, 3 or 4 industry leaders getting together and saying, here's a list of 3 or 4 trade associations. Do you mind participating in some Zoom calls? And the reason why is that I've learned that these strategic partnerships add accretive value to industries, and it would be well worth our while to find a partnership and to build it. And amongst themselves, they develop a list of questions that they want answered when they talk to a trade association president. And they agree up front what those benchmarks are that these organizations need to achieve. And I think what they do is they test the ability to build a strategic partnership with the president of a trade association. It's really as simple as that. I could make it more complicated. It's not. And then I think it's a series of a handful of follow-up conversations of what it could be, what it would look like, and how they would work together.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it really requires at least one person to have a vision of what could be.
Yes.
And float that to potential partners in order to come together and see what could happen from those Zoom calls or follow-up discussions.
Yes. Yes. And another point that I want to make, and this is really important. So here in the United States, I get asked questions all the time. How can anything happen in Congress or with an administration when there's so many divergent views where nobody agrees? And what I point out to them through the book is that these 5 industries are able to get things done because of these larger ecosystems that they've built. Here in the United States, the recreational boating industry, they became part of an outdoor recreation ecosystem. Here in the United States, they had passed and President Obama signed legislation that recognized the outdoor recreation industry as a contributing component of the United States gross domestic product, as drivers of the economy, recognized as delivering 2.1% of gross domestic product in what is a $20 trillion economy. Think about that. That's pretty powerful stuff. And they're able to utilize that and leverage that when they talk to elected officials. But they were able to do that because it wasn't just the boating industry. All forms of outdoor recreation came together and said, what is it that we can do together that we couldn't do apart? One, we want the ability to have influence that goes beyond political party. We want to be able to demonstrate that we're key contributors to the economy and that we want to work with elected officials or regulatory officials in building good policy that is a win for them and a win for us.
Brilliant.
So it's like I've seen reimagination unfold right before me, and it's really impressive.
I'm curious, there's probably a few listeners who might be exceptional visionaries, who can really see the big picture, that might like listening to our conversation, going, you know what, I've had these ideas, these visions, and I've tried taking them to other people, and I just can't seem to get anywhere, simply because they say, you're completely off the scale, you're right up there, there's no way we can work with you, it's too big, too scary, too hard. What would you say to such folk who very much desire to collaborate and work with other people,
Sure,
but seem quite difficult to get traction?
I really appreciate you asking that question. One of my favorite business books was written by Howard Schultz in the mid-90s. He's the founder and former CEO of Starbucks. And in that book, one of the things that he says very powerfully is that vision is what they call it when others can't see what you. And if you understand that at the beginning, it gives you the ability to start to take your vision and to test it. So instead of looking to sell your vision, you're looking to test it and get feedback on it. And with that feedback, get buy-in. And one of the things you'll find interesting, I've written a lot of articles, or even my book. And I share draft chapters with people on the front end. And you're going to say, why did I do that? I had a vision, but the vision didn't matter unless other people were willing to own it. Other people were willing to own it. So when I've written some articles on whether it be the supply chains or the energy issues, I shop it around and I look to get people to own it. So again, vision is what they call it when others can't see it, but it gives you license to begin to build out and branch out and get what could be a broader vision with more people that own it. It won't look anything like it did when you first scratched it out or sketched it out, but it'll be even better because you create a lot of owners along the way.
That's an interesting idea. You've talked about how we could do it with a book concept. What would it look like in terms of putting together a strategic partnership idea? Could you walk us through how we could test that?
Sure. A strategic partnership idea from one business to another?
Yep.
Okay, sure. Let's game that out. Interestingly enough, if you're looking to, let's say your issue is you want to grow market share and there's another company that's in a market that you're not. And you open the door by talking about where you are, what you'd like to achieve, and you'd like to learn what they'd like to achieve, but you'd like to start talking about commonality of challenges, commonality of culture, and commonality of outcomes. And starting off with that, and then from that, beginning to game out what a potential partnership would look like. But it's a strategic partnership is not something that happens in an hour or a day or a week or even a month. It's something that happens over time. And the most important part of that, we've talked about culture, is building trust. And you build trust one conversation after another. And in some cases, the partnership starts out working on smaller things together, and then it builds and you're working on bigger things together. So it's important not to think, here's a good analogy. It's really not smart to ask to go on the first date and ask someone to marry you on the first date.
Sure.
So what you're really looking to do is to really test the boundaries of the relationship of what you can do together, and then start off small and then build it out over time.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, finding common ground, small areas of potential growth, benefit, mutual benefit would be the key area, key areas to consolidate before you perhaps put out an idea, maybe a document that you float past potential members, see what they have about it, if you're open to the idea, and then build out from there. That would be the process that you recommend.
Yes. Absolutely. It's, to me, here in the greater Washington, D.C. area, I've created a community of association CEOs, and there's 54 of them. It's called the Strategic Guidance Lab. And we've created a place by which everybody can trust one another and share with one another and care about each other. And it works really well. And I started, it'll be 3 years in April. But I am a notorious community builder. I love building communities. It energizes me to be part of a group that help others resolve challenges and be successful. And another thing about that Starbucks book, Pour Your Heart Into It, Howard Schultz ends the book by saying, the most rewarding thing is everyone crossing the finish line together.
Yep.
And to me, it is. And I look to do that every day. I do it with my team. I look to do it with clients. And it's just the power of partnership. It's just, when it builds over time, it becomes unstoppable.
I love what you're saying. I'm also conscious of the fact that a lot of our listeners are numbers and want the hard results to be able to ensure that there's progress, etc. And on the flip side of that is also risk minimization.
Sure.
So with this idea of strategic partnerships, as wonderful as the possibilities sound, how do we ensure that we're going in, at the very least, to minimize our risks and put in the metrics in order to ensure that there's growth? I'm sure that kind of exists in our existing business formats as well, but perhaps you could speak to it from your experiences.
So what was interesting in our research for the book, one of our greater takeaways was the extent to which that there was a lot agreed upon in the front end of these partnerships. There were KPIs and there were performance metrics, and they even went so far as to agree when it was they were going to meet and how it is they were going to stay in touch with one another. So at the end of the day, they're functional relationships because they discussed and agreed to terms on the front end. That's the only way to do it, I think. It's the only way to do it. And I want to talk a bit about risk mitigation. So let's say two small companies or two mid-sized companies are looking to build a partnership. Here's what's interesting. There's risk mitigation and there's risk mitigation. I can't think of any other better way to mitigate your risks than by working with another small or mid-sized company and openly acknowledging what the challenges and the risks are, and the both of you doing more than your level best to mitigate those risks. Because on the upside, if one side wins, the other side wins. But on the downside, if one side loses, the other side loses. So risk mitigation is understanding the scenarios or issues that could arise that will cause it to come undone. So that's why really good scenario planning as you're building these partnerships is important. What do we do in this situation? What do we do in that situation? And then identifying what the risks are and putting the risk mitigation in place on the front end of the partnership. That's the way it's done. You minimize and mitigate risks. But you do that because if both sides win, one side wins, both sides win. If one side, we want to create the win-win. And part of that is minimizing and mitigating your risks. It's like, where's our exposure?
Yeah.
And how do we minimize that?
Yeah, very interesting and fascinating discussion we've had so far. Dan, thank you for this. To wrap things up, Dan, no, we've covered a fair bit of ground, but would you say that there are perhaps a couple of key aspects that don't get talked about very much when it comes to this whole idea of strategic partnerships, especially in light of trade associations? And if so, what would they be?
I think nowadays, trade associations are not yesterday's trade associations anymore. The really good ones have the ability to think and act as much about the industry as the industry leaders themselves. That if you're looking for a way to position the industry for the long term and create a rising tide that lifts all boats strategy, a strategic partnership between an industry and a trade association is critical. So now I want to talk about some examples of that. What's interesting is, and I've done quite a bit of writing in addition to the book since the book was published, and I've written articles about supply chains. And I want you to think of the entire supply chain of an industry getting together at a trade association. Trade associations are neutral conveners. The focus would be on pre-competitive issues. What are the regulatory things that we need to do together in order to optimize the success of our supply chains? Think about that, right? Another example of this is energy. Understandably, we want to reduce the carbon footprint in the world, but here in the United States, there's, over the last couple of years, this focus on, we want to go green, we want to do it today. Here's the issue, is that good strategy is built on long-term thinking. And we've seen energy prices go up, whether it be gasoline, whether it be electric, natural gas, so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, what I've suggested in an article just a couple of months ago that I wrote on MarketWatch is this concept that if you get everyone from biomass to solar to petroleum and coal together in an ecosystem, they could think through a 25-year roadmap that would take us from where we are to where we want to be in 25 years. There's going to have to be some short-term and midterm things we're going to have to do, but ultimately we will get there. And here in the United States, from President Carter's administration to President Biden's administration, we've had a seesaw back and forth of policy, and it's been unproductive. In the end, it hurts the consumer. So it's time for the entire industry, through a strategic partnership in the energy space, to build what will be a 25-year roadmap. Then they can go and sell it to consumers. And together with the consumers, they can go to elected officials and say, we figured out a way to make this work over the next 25 years. I know it sounds crazy, but remember, vision is what you call it when others can't see it. It's about building partnerships, one partnership at a time, getting feedback on what it could be and what it might be, and modifying, reshaping the view as you go along.
Brilliant. And then if listeners are curious and want to find out more or connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
Clearly, you can go to our website at potomaccorp.com. You can email us at team@potomaccorp.com. You can find Potomac Corp on Twitter. We're at Core Potomac. You can find me at Twitter at DanV. You can find the company Potomac Corp and you can find me on LinkedIn. So there's almost no way that you couldn't find us, and would be happy to have more conversation.
Your book's available, I believe, on all major retailers, including on the
Yes, we're at Amazon.com. We're at Books A Million. We're at Barnes & Noble, of course. I've got to say that. But if you go to the Potomac Corp website, there's a link to buy the book right on the front page of our website, and you'll have 5 or 6 different options as to where you can buy Reimagining Industry Growth. Now, if you buy it, I'm happy if you send it to me to not only sign up for you, but write a little note in it too.
Brilliant. Dan, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this.
It's a pleasure. Nice speaking with you, and thank you so much for having me on your podcast.